So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Carbon Offsets, Promise, Perils, and the Path Forward in an Era of Rapid Climate Change. My name is Stephen Porter. I serve as the Associate Provost for Sustainability here at Brown, where I'm also a professor of ecology, evolutionary and organismal biology, and environment and society, which is ridiculously long. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our moderators, our esteemed panelists, and all of you. Thank you so much for coming out bright and early for this, what promises to be a really amazing day. I'd like to start by thanking a few people. First and foremost, the fantastic team at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, particularly Jessica Warrington, Lily Lustig, and Katie Silberman, and Christy Dos Reyes and Kristen Jones from the Provost's office, all of whom have done an amazing job helping us organize. In addition to that, I really want to thank our student volunteers who have just been going above and beyond for quite some time now, and especially in the last few days, making sure our panelists have what they need, and basically just making sure everything is working great. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our financial support, both from IBIS, whose building you sit in, but also from the Provost's office, and Jeff Colgan and the Climate Solutions Lab. I'm not going to talk for too long before the panel begins, but I do want to give you a sense of why, or the birth of this conference, or the idea. In many ways, the motivation for this conference, or at least my own motivation, started when I was faced with making a decision. Brown had just pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2040 and achieve a 75% reduction in emissions by 2025. We were in 2022, and we had set up contracts to purchase emissions-free electricity from new build renewable projects, most of which are in Rhode Island. That would reduce our campus emissions by 50%. We had planned to reach our 2025 goal, again, of a 75% reduction by switching to some renewable fuels in our central heating facility. But after several rounds of study, we found that pathway just was not viable. So the question was what to do. I had vehemently argued against using carbon offsets when we had originally set our goal, our decarbonization goals. I wanted, quote, real reductions. Stop buying fossil fuels, right? And to me, that was the only way to go, but we were moving as fast as we could on that engineering challenge of retrofitting the campus and switching our heating system to all renewable electricity. And that wasn't going to make our 2025 goal of 75% reduction. We were sort of stuck at 50% in the short term. So the question then became what to do. Should we buy offsets? If so, what kind of offsets? Would that slow us down and create the kind of moral hazard that people worry about, that we would spend money on offsets and not remain committed to our elimination of fossil fuels? So when I was faced with that challenge, the sort of abstract concept of whether or not to buy offsets became really real, and I realized I didn't understand well enough how to make that decision. In the end, we bought some offsets to get us from 50% to 25% for a finite period of time. And while I think it was the right decision, I must confess I have doubts. I have days when those doubts resurface. And as I discuss this with colleagues, and I particularly want to acknowledge Jim Kellner, who's one of our moderators, but also a host of people in facilities management here, in the president and provost's office, as well as colleagues around the world, around the country and around the world, it became clear this was a question everyone was grappling with. Everyone was trying to do the best they could and wasn't sure how to utilize offsets versus other things. So I'm a biogeochemist by training, and I study the flux and storage of carbon in ecosystems. And I simply wanted to reduce the number of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere by the most possible as fast as possible. And it seemed to me that I didn't understand enough about the way carbon markets were working to understand how much I should use those to achieve that goal. So the more I learned, as with many things, the more I didn't know. And as I talked with Jim and others, particularly Ricardo Bion, another moderator of today's event, we decided that it would be really wonderful to include a broader range from our community and from around the country and around the world to bring this discussion out into the public a little bit more and to talk to people who are deeply expert in ways that we were not. thanks to Ricardo, really, and his unbelievable Rolodex. And for those of you who don't know what a Rolodex is, you can look it up. We have an incredible group of panelists here today, and I hope everyone in the room will emerge from our conversation thinking differently than they did when they walked in, and leave here excited to push for what we all want, a decarbonized world with a safe, stable climate where we can all prosper. So with that background, let me give you a brief rundown of the day, and then I'll turn it over to Ricardo and the first panel. The first panel, which will run for about an hour and a half, is going to set the stage for the state of voluntary carbon markets. We will then move to talk specifically on a panel moderated by Jim Kellner on nature-based carbon offsets before we break for lunch. There will be lunch provided for the panelists, but for the general audience, you're on your own for lunch. Sorry about that. And then we will come back at 1:30 for a discussion that I will lead or moderate, for a panel on institutional engagement in voluntary carbon offsetting, and we'll wrap up with some closing remarks, and then there will be a brief reception that's open to everybody. Each panel will have about an hour, and then about a half hour for questions after that. Okay, I would be remiss if I did not ask you to join the IBIS Alumni and Family Network, so if you have a phone and want to point the camera towards this QR code, it will take you to a site where you can sign up. Kim, that one was for you. Kim Cobb, our director of IBIS, is in the room here. So, well, thank you, Kim, for coming. Okay, so our first panel discussion is on the state of voluntary carbon markets, and our moderator, Ricardo Bion, is also one of the conference organizers. Ricardo is the co-founder and senior partner of Encourage Capital and is also an adjunct professor here in IBIS. His probably most important credential, of course, is that he is Brown alum, class of 1989. And I just learned yesterday that he was one of those brave few who made up his own concentration in ecological applications of science and technology to development, which makes him, I think, the only person in the world I know who's actually working in the field of his college major. So with that, I'll welcome Ricardo and the panel, and they'll start us off.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. It's funny because I did use the Rolodex comment one time in my class, and a bunch of people were like, "What's a Rolodex?" So, for those of you who don't know, it was scrolling and clicking before there was an iPhone. All right, it was the most beautiful scrolling, turning thing to get your addresses from. Really advanced. Now you have to explain to us these QR codes because we don't understand all those things. So yeah, thank you for coming. I'm Ricardo Bion. As Stephen said, I'm a partner and founder at a group called Encourage Capital. We're an impact investment firm. And I've been involved in carbon markets pretty much since the beginning, since the late 90s, partly because I think they are an interesting example of how do you internalize externalities into our economic system. And I think that is a huge problem with all of the environmental problems we face, that we are not seeing the values and benefits of environmental systems in our economic system. Our economic system is outdated. It was developed, at a time when what was scarce was capital and labor, so it kind of focused on capital and labor. Natural resources were the problem to be dealt with, not something that would become scarce. And I think we're shifting into a very different world, a world where actually natural resources are becoming more and more scarce. And carbon markets are interesting because they are one of the first biggest sort of attempts to do that, to internalize these ecosystem services, to put a value on carbon and what have you. And we may see this happening on biodiversity, on water, maybe even as far as pollination, other ecosystem services. So I set up a thing called the Ecosystem Marketplace way back when, which was a news and information site on environmental markets. I wrote a book on voluntary carbon markets back in the day in 2005, the dark ages when we thought all of this was so cool and new and everything was going to change by 2007. Everything was going to be wonderful, and here we are way later than that. having some of the same discussions we were having back then, sadly. I think things have moved, but it does feel sometimes like we're going back and forth. So with that, what I'll do is I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I want this to be a conversation. I want this to be a discussion about some of the biggest issues of offsets as we sort of set the stage for what's to come the rest of the day. And then we'll take it from there, and then we'll take some questions. So, Nat, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. Well, thanks, Ricardo. I'm Nat Cohan. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. I'll say more about that in a minute. I just want to say thank you, first of all. Thank you to Ricardo and to Steve and the organizers. And thanks to all of you. This is an amazing turnout at 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. And so I think it's really great to see this level of interest. I also want to just underscore when the organizers at every place will say, we've got a great, but this is like a pretty, I'm very honored to be on the stage with Rachel and Annette, and the other folks in the panels to come are a pretty amazing lineup. So thank you for including me. So C2S, just briefly, because Ricardo's going to cut me off otherwise, C2S is, we started off about 25 years ago as the Pew Center on Climate Change, one of the first organizations really focused on climate. We spun out as an independent nonprofit based just outside Washington, D.C. in about 12 or 13 years ago. We work on federal policy. We have a business council that we work with to try to advocate for strong and effective and ambitious climate policies. We work in the international space, trying to help the negotiations around the Paris Agreement move along. And we work on climate resilience increasingly because we think we need to build resilience. And everything we do is we talk about our mission as accelerating the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. And part of that is, as you'll hear, working on markets. Just for me, so you know where I'm coming from, I'm an economist. I taught economics at the School of Management at Yale for a number of years before leaving the academic world and diving into the policy world. I spent a lot of time at Environmental Defense Fund, which is also a very markets-oriented group, and I spent a couple of years in the Obama administration in the National Economic Council.
Thank you. Thanks for keeping it brief, Nat. Rachel, let's see if you can match that. Come on.
Well, I'd like to join Nat in thanking everybody here at Brown. It's lovely to be here. The magnolias are just about to blossom, and it stopped raining, so it's nice. And also, I'm a proud parent of a Brown freshman, so it's really lovely to be here. I'm here wearing my hat as one of the co-chairs of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. I've had a peripatetic career around climate and sustainability and finance. More than 30 years ago, you talk about Rolodexes, more than 30 years ago I worked with Professor Bayon in a day when you couldn't actually just email a government to get them to come to a meeting. You had to telex them and fax them, for those of you who don't know how to operate a telex. There you go. So I think some of the NGOs you could actually email at that point, but not governments.
You had to unscrew the phone thing and put alligator clips on the phone wires in a modem that was like so slow.
And we were living and working in Geneva, and we went to New York for something, and I bought my first sort of laptop in New York, and then I had to like cut the cable off, because if you arrived with electronics at Geneva Airport, I hope they're not watching, they would haul you to one side, so you had to look like that. Anyway, never mind. So that back in the day. So since then, I worked in a series of NGOs and international organisations. I had a long career at the World Bank Group on the finance side, and actually managed the bank's carbon markets activity for a period of years. Worked at the UN, and then moved into academia. Was recently the dean of the Fletcher School up the road at Tufts, and now am a professor of practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. And then I co-chair VCMI. VCMI was created in 2021 to focus on the integrity necessary on the demand side of the voluntary carbon market. So what should companies have to do in order to be able to use use the voluntary carbon markets with integrity, meaning to be able to help them speed towards their net zero targets, but also to be able to provide a reliable revenue stream for the countries and the communities that can produce the carbon credits or offsets that would be important to the market. So more about that as we get into the discussion.
Yeah, we'll get right into that. Annette, you want to introduce?
Well, thank you. I'm Annette Nazareth. It's great to be home. I'm a Providence native originally, so I actually, when my parents had me, I lived on Hope Street. So I was in Rhode Island, I think as you can probably tell from the accent, until I was about 21 years old. So class of 78 and the mother of a class of 13 member and proud lacrosse player here at Brown. And so it's really wonderful to be here. I am the chair of a new international organization, independent standard setter called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. Like VCMI, we were formed in 2021 to focus on the supply side of carbon credits. Our mission is really to, and I believe we're far along in this process of establishing the standards for high integrity carbon credits. To ensure that they meet and achieve the goals of meaningfully reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So bringing integrity to this market is incredibly important to us. With VCMI, we like to say that we're creating end-to-end integrity because we're focused on the supply side and the markets on which carbon credits trade. And as Rachel said, VCMI is focused on the appropriate use of credits on the demand side. So we work very closely together and very cooperatively. My background is, after Brown, I studied at Columbia Law School and was a securities and derivatives lawyer on Wall Street, and at some point decided to go into the government. And I ran the Division of Trading and Markets at the Securities and Exchange Commission for 7 years, which is the division that oversees all of the activities of the U.S. securities markets and all the broker-dealers, investment banks, clearinghouses. So I have a regulatory background, and then became a commissioner of the SEC. So I like to think that what I've brought to this engagement is really marrying market regulatory expertise with what we were very fortunate to have, which was really good expertise on the climate science side. So bringing the two together, we hope, will really make a difference in being able to stand up high-integrity voluntary carbon markets that can scale and that can really make a difference to our carbon footprint.
Thank you, Annette. I think you'll see we have an incredible panel up here of people who are at the heart of thinking about regulating and bringing integrity to carbon markets and carbon offsets. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the controversies around carbon offsets today through the course of the day. But before that, I thought what would be useful is to give a little bit of background about what carbon offsets are and are not. And so I'll take a shot at it, and I'm pretty sure, knowing the three people up here, that I'll be corrected multiple times, and we can, get that out of the way before we dive into some of the really nitty-gritty of things that are happening. And some of you who are carbon geeks or wonks will have seen that there's a whole brouhaha out there right now around an entity called the Science-Based Targets Initiative and recent announcements around offsets, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Obviously not about the internal workings of SBTI, so don't come here for the gossip, but really about what are the issues that people are fighting about, because I think it's important. So first, people often say, look, carbon markets are huge. They're $900 billion. And that's true, but that is not the offsets markets, and that is not the voluntary carbon markets. 899 billion, and I'm making that number up, but something along that line, are regulated carbon markets, markets set up by governments for emissions reductions. And what gets traded there is not necessarily offsets, although some do include offsets, but it's what are known as allowances. So how does that work? This is your standard cap and trade market. Basically, a government says, we're going to limit emissions, we're going to allocate to the emitters in the country, and we're going to say to them, okay, you're emitting such an amount. Now we want you to emit less than that, and if you go over that number, you have to find somebody who's emitting less than their allocation and buy it from them. And some places like California, Europe, elsewhere, say, for a tiny bit of that, you can use offsets. But the brouhaha that a lot of people have around offsets isn't about the regulated markets. It's about the voluntary carbon markets, which probably are only about $2 billion out of that $900 billion that you see around carbon markets. And this is important because, one side regulated by governments, the other side voluntary. These are companies doing this voluntarily, no government forcing them to buy offsets. All right, so with that out of the way, let's focus it on offsets. Maybe, Nat, I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see offsets, where this has come from, and maybe some of the key issues that you think we should delve in here today?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. And I love the intro you gave. And as an economist, I love the sort of the brief Ec 101 sort of cap and trade and the distinction between that. So maybe I'll make a couple points because I know that Rachel and Annette will have a lot to add. But the first one is just to sort of further kind of clarify this point that what we're talking about here when we talk about the voluntary carbon market is I come back to that word voluntary. Sometimes you'll hear some people, we want to talk about the verified carbon market because it's also verified. That's also true. We'll talk about how you verify the emissions reductions are real. But the reason I underscore voluntary is to double down on the point that Ricardo made. We're talking about largely companies, but maybe also Stephen, I loved the story you told about Brown, right? Sometimes it's institutions, academic institutions, NGOs, and so on. But often these are companies that have made a climate commitment. They've made that to their shareholders or their employees or something, and maybe they've said they're going to be net zero or they're going to be carbon neutral or they're going to cut their emissions by such and such. And some of those companies, for reasons that Stephen talked about, and we can talk about more, may choose to do that in part by buying, and I like to say carbon credits. So we talked about this. Offset, I think about offset as a verb, right? There are different ways of using carbon credits. So the first thing to note is we're talking about a voluntary situation where companies are doing, largely companies or organizations are doing this on their own. They're not required to do so by a government. So that already sets the case for what can we do and what can't we do. I'll say as an aside, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are skeptical about the environmental side of the carbon market, and we'll get into that. I'm an economist. I started off until 3 or 4 years ago, I was skeptical as an economist of the voluntary carbon market because I taught economics. If you've taken economics, economists always say, well, look, there are public goods. A healthy climate is a public good. So nobody's going to pay for that. And so we shouldn't. And so I spent a lot of time at EDI. I spent a lot of time working on cap and trade markets. If you want to talk about anything in the cap and trade world, come to me. We can wonk out about it. But because I was really focused on regulatory settings, and I still think, as Ricardo said, that's still a couple, 3 orders of magnitude greater. But what I came to realize in the last few years, and many of people, including David Antonio, who's up here, who's been sort of in this market for a long, long time, I realized there was actually real appetite among companies to take on and meet voluntary corporate climate commitments. And that one tool for them to do that, and they were willing to put real money. I'm talking about millions of dollars per company. I'm talking about potentially billions of dollars. We can talk about the scale. Real money into carbon credits that represented real emissions reductions if they could only find them. And that's when I started thinking, maybe there's something here. And so I actually got involved and I actually work with Annette. Annette is representing the Integrity Council, but I help out behind the scenes, and C2S is a member of the Secretariat. So help to create that, help to work in this scale. So that's sort of my own journey was, actually there's something here, and there's a tool we can use. Last thing I just want to say is very concretely, because sometimes it seems very abstract. Like, what are we talking about? So I've talked about what companies do. I'm sure we'll talk more in the nature-based. But here's there's a lot of different categories of carbon credits. But here are kind of 3 concrete examples. And there are lots more. One category, I used to work at Environmental Defense Fund. We had a program in India that was working on cook stoves, clean cook stoves, methane stoves to replace dirty open-air wood stoves that had huge air pollution problems, all sorts of environmental knock-on effects. You reduce emissions if you capture methane from the manure and you burn it in a stove instead of gathering wood and burning it in a wood stove. You can measure those amount of reduced emissions, and if you can measure and monitor the use of the stove and so on, you can say, okay, there is a reduction in emissions. It may be a ton per household, so it may be small, but there's a reduction in emissions there from that shift to a cleaner cook stove. If you can measure that and credit it, and that's what other organizations do, that can be a little extra finance to that that rural household to help them buy the stove, help them sort of do other things, and then that represents a benefit to the environment. So that's one example, a very small scale. A larger example, we'll talk about nature-based. I've worked a lot on what are called jurisdictional scale programs. We can talk more about what that means, but think about an approach to saving tropical forests that takes place across the entire size of a country, like Costa Rica, or a state like the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil, which is one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world. And if you can measure emissions reductions across from saving tropical forests across that entire state, you measure those, you verify that those are happening, you can create carbon credits at that massive landscape scale, which could be millions of carbon credits at a time. And then the final thing I'll say is, on the technology front, you can capture carbon dioxide, you can pull it out of the air and store it underground. That's very expensive right now. But if we do more of it, maybe we'll bring the cost down. And that's like a third kind of carbon credit. Yeah. There are many more, but that maybe just gives you a concrete sense of what we're talking about when we talk about a carbon credit.
And I think there's a lot of really interesting points in what you're saying there, not least of which is that, you know, 2 of the 3 examples you gave are actually money flowing into developing countries, emerging markets, the global south, however you want to think about it. And you know, it's one of the few mechanisms for channeling money and capital to the global south through these markets. And yes, governments have said, we're going to set up these multi-billion-dollar pots of money that are going to channel money down to developing countries to help them decarbonize. You know, I challenge you to look at actually how much money has flown from those commitments. So that's a really important point. I want to dig in also on something you said around as an economist and these carbon offsets. And also build on what Stephen said in the introduction, right? Which is to say, hey, if you could reduce a ton, and assuming a ton is a ton, and a ton doesn't matter where you reduce it from the atmospheric perspective, if decarbonizing internally costs you, I don't know, $100 a ton, $200 a ton, but doing these types of projects on stoves do deliver a ton. And we'll get into, like, does it really deliver a ton? Because that's part of the discussion, right? But assuming it does, and it costs you $2 a ton, $5 a ton, so you can get 10 times more tons for the same $200, as an economist, you would say, do the cheaper one, do the less expensive one, you'll get 10 times more. Now, if you ask yourself, well, maybe half of those are not real, you're still getting 5 times more, you know? Even if it's 80% of them are not real, you're still getting 2 times more, right? So am I thinking about this right now or not?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and I'm sure Rachel and Annette yeah, you're certainly thinking about it right from an economist's perspective, and I think that is, and I think that point.
I don't ever want to be accused of being an economist.
No, and I mean, we'll come back to more because there are other dimensions, and I want to talk about other theories of change, but maybe later on. But the one thing I'll say now is I think this point that you just raised, Ricardo, about sort of what's the tolerance for error, I think it's a really interesting point, and I'm sure different people will think about it differently. But I do think it's interesting to think about the idea that, okay, because we can, just in terms of the numbers, it likely is so much more cost effective to, if all you're thinking about is the number of tons you want to reduce, and there are other metrics we can talk about in the long run, but if you're just thinking like, how do I reduce more tons sooner, then you do want to look at that cost per ton. And I think there really is this interesting thing. There's this interesting question about, like, how sure do we need to be about the quality of the ton? Now, if 80% of the credits are bad, that's probably just not good. And we're not going to have a healthy market. But suppose 10% of the credits, and not that they're fraud or that people are doing bad things, but just measurement error and so on. But if 10% of the credits, you might think, oh my gosh, 10%, that's terrible. That's a big fraction. But I would probably rather have $10 billion flowing into carbon markets at $20 a ton. So we're talking about 500 million tons a year, and 500 million credits a year. right? And let's say 90%, let's say 10% of those are bad. So you're actually 450 million, or not bad, they're just not real. I'd rather have 450, even 400 million tons getting reduced in a year, rather than have a much smaller market where we were 99% sure that everything was right, but that much smaller market was only $1 billion. And so that I think is the kind of
And we can
tragedy.
talk about that tolerance for error, but I think there's another point that I think Stephen's introduction opens up here, which is, yeah, we can fix what's going on at Brown if we give us 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. Or we can buy offsets now, but there is also a time value of carbon, right? Having carbon reductions now is better than having the same carbon reductions 10 years from now, right? Because you're actually reducing for the full 10 years until the other solution comes in, right? That ton is out of the atmosphere for those full 10 years. So there is that time value of carbon. But let's dig right into sort of the problems and the critiques of the voluntary carbon market that are out there, right? I'd say there's several layers of them. One of them is to say, these tons aren't real, they're not happening, we can't tell that they're happening, right? And that's where I want to turn to Annette at some point to talk about, so how do we know, and how do we know that that's real? The other critique is that these are just greenwashing. They're pulling our attention away from the really important stuff, which is decarbonizing internally, and that's what we should be doing, right? Not taking our attention away from that fact. And that's more on the demand side for the carbon, and that's where I would love to hear Rachel's views on that. And then if you want to get really wonky, there's this whole concept of additionality. Would that reduction have happened anyways? And if that reduction had happened anyways, then we're not really changing the system, and we're allowing somebody to emit somewhere else. So that's a problem. But there are a lot of different ways to think about additionality, and we'll hear about some of them today that might actually be better going forward. So let's dig into integrity, or if you want to jump in on anything that we've said before, Annette, maybe you can talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing.
Sure. Well, to follow on some of what Nat said, I think about the carbon markets as like this gigantic international project finance effort, right? And today, it's not done on markets, it's done bilaterally, and that goes to what Stephen said, right? So the problem we have today is to really purchase a carbon credit, you have to individually negotiate. You can worry about quality, right? So you can't scale up a market. You can't do this in any meaningful size if every time you have a transaction, you sort of have to hire somebody to do the due diligence who's got the background to know whether you're investing in a good credit or not. And I mean, that's a problem. And so we've seen some very good credits, and we've seen some not so good credits. And, as you read in the press, I mean, sometimes people who did hire those smart scientists to look at these things and kick the tires, even then, the projects may not have delivered. So what we have today is a market it's opaque, it's not as transparent as it should be, it's very difficult to understand the pricing, it's not liquid, it's all the things that, as a former market regulator, you'd say, that's a market that we don't want to emulate, right? What we want to emulate is highly successful liquid capital markets. And the really exciting opportunity here is, as you said, Ricardo, if you can use the capital markets to bring finance to the global south, where a lot of these opportunities for projects exist, right? We were the big emitters in the global north, and the global south is suffering the first and worst impacts of climate change. And and if we can get finance to them, and as you say, governments have provided all sorts of things that we haven't delivered on, but if the private sector can actually use carbon credits to deliver capital to the global south to pay for real, verifiable projects that reduce and remove emissions, it not only can really have a positive impact on our reductions and removals, I think it has all of these additional benefits because it really is affecting positively, if done right, the economies of the Global South. I mean, we could potentially create, I like to think, a whole generation of green-collar workers, people who now know how to, work on these projects that benefit us all, that they get paid appropriately for it, that I know some folks here are working on different projects that we have on, benefit sharing and things like that. You can there are just so many additional benefits that could come from this, I think, that are very exciting. So, and as you say, a lot of the focus for the Integrity Council is on how do you ensure that these credits are high integrity. And so if you want me to go on in that a little bit.
Talk a little bit about that.
Our mission, really our North Star is to, was to come up with these international standard for what that meant. And we created what we call our core carbon principles, which are 10 principles that really define high integrity credit. And I won't go through all of them, but you mentioned some: additionality, permanence, transparency, no double counting. These are all very important standards. Principles are great, but you can define them very quickly, but to really animate them, you needed rules. And we have 137 pages of rules, which are really our assessment framework. So how do you ensure that those principles have been satisfied? And they apply at two levels. They apply both to carbon crediting programs that issue the credits. So I think of it almost like intermediary regulation. It's almost like broker-dealer regulation, making sure that the people who are issuing these credits are enforcing these principles. And so what they're doing is ensuring that the projects that they are issuing credits on have actually satisfied these requirements, and that they themselves, the carbon crediting programs, have appropriate governance to ensure that this is all done appropriately. But besides that, we have to apply those principles to the methodologies. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, because we've got 100 methodologies that we are in the process of assessing, and we're hoping to get them assessed by September.
And
so,
just for people who
yeah.
may not understand what is a methodology, how does
Right.
that differ from a standard? So there's a number of bodies out there that for many years, and David Antonioli, who will be speaking later, ran one of them called Vera, which have been basically applying some of these principles that they've come up with of what makes a good carbon credit and saying, all right, these are the principles of what makes a good carbon credit. Now send us ideas of reduction projects and how you would apply these criteria for the reduction credits, whether it's cook stoves or deforestation or anything else. And each of those has a methodology for how you measure, how you monitor, how you know, all this stuff. So that's the level at which you're regulating, right?
Correct.
Or
And
not
I have to
regulating.
say, we're very excited about the progress that's been made. When we got to, Rachel and I and Nat got to Dubai in early December, we were able to say, yes, this is a voluntary program, but by that time, carbon crediting programs representing 98% of existing credits had applied for our designation, which means there is enormous buy-in to this effort. Mm-hmm. In some of the programs, a number of them had waited a little bit of time. We were ready for them to apply in July. A number of them took a few months to apply. That's because they were ensuring that their programs had met the standards. So they actually had gone to their boards and even improved on some of what they had so that when they applied, they would satisfy the requirements. In the meantime, we've also seen revisions to a number of methodologies. We were told by Vera, for instance, not to assess some of their legacy methodologies, that they had come up with new methodologies, new and improved methodologies, and those are the ones that we are going to assess. And so what we're seeing is, even in the process of doing our work, we believe that the market has raised its requirements in order to meet these standards. So it's already had a very positive impact on the market.
And I think this is another popular misconception, that you can just say, I'm reducing emissions, here, give me money. It's a really involved process of, is there a methodology for what you're talking about? Are you measuring? Are you monitoring? How do you know? And you have to submit a proposal. You have to get an independent third party to assess that proposal. And then you have to pass it through all these rings. And now we're saying, we created this entity, called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, to oversee and make sure that these things are being done with that level of credibility. So that's one way we can assure integrity, and that goes to the, is the carbon real? And now I want to turn to Rachel, which is kind of on the other side of that equation. And I know when we first created the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets and then the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, many of us joked that this was like a Monty Python sketch of like, no, I'm the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Markets, you're the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, right? But there's a rationale and there's reason behind this, right? On one side you have the supply of the carbon, the other side, you have the demand of the carbon. If you're a company using carbon credits, how should you use those carbon credits? When should you use those carbon credits? Can you do that the right way? And what is the wrong way to do that? And so maybe, Rachel, you can tell us a little bit about how you guys have been working on that demand side for carbon credits.
Thank you. Well, I think it's just for a little moment, it's worth casting our minds back to what was going on in 2021 when we were both founded. So we were all sort of struggling with a pandemic. We'd missed a COP. The British government was focused on Glasgow in November 2021. Without getting into a whole sort of dissection of the British government's approach to that COP, it was very clear that they were looking for sort of real breakthroughs. And I think there were some very important business figures and important finance figures who were saying, look, there is the potential to grow the carbon markets. The regulated markets were growing, but the growth hadn't been as exponential or as broadly geographic as I think people hoped in Paris. And that there was room for a voluntary market alongside regulated markets. And I think the theory of change was that voluntary markets would eventually be a sort of glide path to regulation, that ideally we would we'd have effective carbon prices in all jurisdictions, and we would get serious about what we'd signed in 2015. At the same time, the British government was listening to and in fact Alok Sharma went on a very systematic listening tour, to the extent that that was possible during the pandemic, and was urged to really listen to the voices of emerging markets and developing economies. And they were pretty damn clear that there was one thing that absolutely had to come out of the Glasgow Conference of Parties, which was a flow of finance, a reliable and at scale flow of finance to allow them to make the investments that they needed. And enormous frustration across all of the different issues in finance that weren't working, but also in a deep interest in a functioning carbon market. Why do I say all that? Because what was also going on in 2021 was a toxic level of mistrust, right? And I think that still exists today. We've seen corporate behavior, which has been, I'm trying to think of a polite expletive. Egregious. So we've seen egregious corporate behavior, and all it takes is for one egregious act of corporate behavior to taint a whole sector of industry, to taint all activities in a given jurisdiction, to taint a whole process. And we didn't just see it once, we've seen it again and again, and we've seen certain sectors of the economy, pushed to the margin, pushed to the absolute limits, what could be legitimately said around certain things. We've also seen jurisdictions desperate for investment, and we've seen huge asymmetric sort of power and information and technical capability. And all of that has shaped, in the past, bad things that have happened in voluntary markets, right? But the bad things that have happened in the broad area of corporate accountability when it comes to climate. But in the sort of 5-6 years after Paris, an extraordinary number of countries had set companies had set net zero targets. An extraordinary number of countries had set net zero targets. And so you was beginning to see a real building up of demand for a way to be able to meet those net zero targets. So now let's go to the corporate. So you're a corporate, you've set a net zero target. Hopefully you've had that approved or signed off on by a science-based target authority, right? And those are voluntary as well. And there's more than one of them, though the one that is perhaps the most important or more widely used is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So you've set yourself a net zero target and somebody's said, it's legit. You then have to manage over time. It's a transition, right? Your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3 emissions. So scope 1, your operation, scope 2, the energy that you're purchasing, scope 3, your value chain. With the best will in the world, most companies will struggle to be able to work out exactly how to achieve their scope 3 targets like today, right? This is very different. You're operating in, perhaps you're a global firm, food and beverage, an energy company, maybe you are a financial institution. You're operating in multiple jurisdictions where large parts of the regulation that you would need aren't in place. You may not be able to access clean energy on a reliable basis. That's your scope 2. But your scope 3 may be very difficult. And so you've set yourself a target. You do not wish to attract negative attention because you're slipping on your interim targets towards that eventual target. This is complicated stuff, and you see firms spending extraordinary amounts of time and effort trying to make sure that they can legitimately work out how to get to that target. And to what extent can they use carbon credits to meet that target? The point is, in your net zero target, to reduce your carbon footprint, right? We are decarbonising. So just offsetting your operations is not decarbonising. And of course, in the past, we've seen, before Paris, I think even around about Paris, we've seen highly carbonised companies in sectors for whom decarbonisation is not the goal, right, engaged in voluntary carbon market activity where you couldn't actually verify the quality of the credit, on and on. But I don't think that's where we were in 2021, and it's certainly not where we are today. And so fast forward to, the only thing I'd say about 2021 is we've got Greta Thunberg and her allies correctly calling out greenwash. We've still got corporate behaviour of sort of obfuscation and sort of lobbying on one side and saying something on the other. In Glasgow, the polluting industries were not allowed into the COP, which was itself a highly political and politicised sort of decision, and it's had its implications now for how business...
So I'm going to fast forward you, Rachel, to today and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative.
Right, but the reason I wanted to give that background is that the greenwash then is now green hush and green lash. Mm-hmm. And this has a huge impact on corporate behaviour.
So maybe explain the green hushing.
So green hush is if you are not sure that your activity is going to count, mean something, or be able to be understood as with integrity or legitimate, you may choose to not do something. So it's not that you're going to do something without integrity, you're just going to do nothing. And so we've seen the lack of clarity about whether or not you can legitimately use credits to take good companies with targets, companies with real plans, and we've seen them therefore decide to just do nothing. Green lash is what has happened in particular in this country over the last 24 months, where you've seen a politically motivated campaign to suggest that anything that would be important in your environment, social and governance performance as a company, that this is not legitimate business, that this is not sensible business. And we've seen this attack coming from attorneys generals and others on companies for trying to be good ESG performers. And that has had its implications in the voluntary carbon market as well. So what started off as an argument about greenwash, which is still going on, has also become an extremely complicated business environment. In the next panel, I'm sure we'll talk about it. So VCMI's approach is on the basis that if you have a target and you have a transition to get to that target, and in the reality of what it means to operate, and it would be different for different companies in different sectors, in different jurisdictions, is there, once you can show that you are committed to decarbonising, to reach your target, is there in your transition a time-bound, circumscribed use of carbon credits in order to get to that point? We believe that there was. We created a code of conduct, which sort of, again, learning the lessons of standard setting and regulation, sort of tries to incentivize you and allows you to have sort of platinum level performance, gold level performance, silver level performance, because different companies in different jurisdictions in different stages of their transition can't all meet the same standard at any one time. And that code of conduct is now published and now available for companies to use. We also have been cognizant that of all of the companies that have set science-based targets, about 96% of them cannot manage their Scope 3 emissions. So these are high-performing companies, motivated companies, operating voluntarily, can't snap their fingers and get to net zero tomorrow. And so what we've said is that, and we've put this out for consultation in a beta mode, right? So we're listening to the market, is that on a time-bound basis, perhaps the emissions that come from your Scope 3 could be things, up to 50% could be available to use credits over a time-bound basis, just to try to jumpstart the transition, because the time-bound value of carbon, if we don't make the transition, we don't get the transition going faster this decade, doesn't matter what we do in the next decade, we're going to be so far behind.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, this question of, like, it is really hard to deal with your Scope 3 emissions. Think about it. This is everything you consume, all your customers. How do you even think about that? How do you even measure that? And I think part of the problem we're facing is that these concepts of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 have been very useful until now, but they're reaching their limits of utility if what we really want is a system that needs to work in many ways like the accounting systems that you were so used to in the SEC, right? Like you have an asset, you have a liability. How do you measure your liabilities? How do you measure your assets? And if you want to get into the supply chain of a company, and if 4 companies are buying from the same paper source, how many of the emissions from that paper, are liabilities for who? And when do they transfer those liabilities? And how do you transfer those liabilities? And there's people at Stanford and other places working on how do you think of e-liabilities and e-liability management. But I think we're going to have to deal with that Scope 3 problem. And, recently in the press, there's been not just attacks on the voluntary carbon market, but there's been this whole brouhaha about one of these science-based targets initiatives that basically said, one of the board said, we're going to look at allowing offsets for a portion of your Scope 3 emissions. The entire staff of that organization wrote a letter saying this is a travesty, and I'm paraphrasing.
It was not the entire staff. It was a handful of staff.
Thanks for the correction. A handful of staff basically said, this is wrong, we need to change this, the CEO needs to resign, some of the board members need to resign. Articles now appeared in Financial Times, Reuters, The Guardian, all about this stuff. And at the heart of it is these questions we're talking about here. Like, how do you use offsets? Should you use offsets? Where are offsets the right things to do? And I think one of the things you hear a lot of people saying is, well, we just need to regulate all this. This voluntary stuff is just greenwashing. So maybe, Nat, you can build on any of this, what we've talked about, and talk a little bit also about, like, yeah, but it'd be great if everybody regulated everything, but we don't live in that world, and how does offsets fit into that world?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot there, and but let me talk a little bit about I think about this a lot about sort of theories of change, and so I want to approach it from that way. I'll say what I mean, but I also want to be doing. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of folks at sort of in the SBT, like those staff, because I think we need to understand there are different approaches to getting to the same goal, which is addressing the climate crisis. Right. The first thing, just briefly, yeah, we could all stipulate that. Government regulatory approaches, mandatory approaches to this would be better. I'm an economist. I believe in market-based approaches, but I believe in market-based approaches ideally backed by government enforcement. So I'd rather see than relying just on the goodwill of companies, as much as I think that's genuine. I'd rather see the government put a cap on pollution and have that decline over time, as it's been done in Europe, as it's been done in California, some northeastern states. I'd like to see that in the U.S. Spent a lot of time on that 15 years ago. It didn't work out. So let's stipulate that, yes, having government, and as Rachel said, this ideally building systems like this that work and have integrity could be an on-ramp toward that, or could build. We could talk about the aviation sector. That's a whole fun thing. It's it's in between the two, where we have tried to build something that is headed towards a regulatory approach. But let's set that aside, because that's not the world we are in today. If anyone wants to talk about the politics of climate in the U.S., come and talk to me. But we're not there now. And so what do we do with the world we have? And the world we have is one in which companies are genuinely, like the remarkable thing, I just want to come back to this, is companies are actually willing to make real corporate climate commitments and to put money behind that. Of course, there are companies that want to do greenwashing, but most of the companies, the overwhelming majority of the thousands of companies with net zero targets, they are doing it. I'll tell you why. They're doing it partly because their shareholders demand it and investors, some of them, although public markets, I'm not sure how powerful that is, partly because of their consumers, although I'm an economist, consumers, like, they say they want it, but how much are they willing to pay? The number one reason, if you talk to companies about why they're doing this, is actually a lot of the folks in this room, it's talent. It's their employees. Companies, this is true for tech companies, but it's also true for other big industrials. They want to attract good, smart people, and increasingly, people are not willing to come to a company where they really disagree with their values. Not every company, but okay, so this is genuine. How do we take advantage of it? I think there are two theories of change that are really important to pull out. Because if we're going to understand the SBTI brouhaha, and if we're going to understand a path forward, I think a lot about the environmental community, how do we build more consensus, we need to understand these two theories of change. The first theory of change is the economist theory of change. We've talked about this. This is the ton is a ton theory of change. I'm very comfortable with this. Climate change, I'm sure everybody knows, climate change is driven by the total stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that accumulates over time. A ton that comes because Brown emits a ton is no different than a ton in Beijing or in Bangladesh or in Brazil. Or even a place that doesn't begin with B, it turns out. So the only thing that matters is the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that concentration, and that concentration is rising, and it's rising more and more fast, as everyone knows. So the ton is a ton view is, this is a crisis. Sea levels are rising, temperatures are rising, we're seeing impacts. We need to cut as many tons as we can, as fast as we can. And if we can do that for $10 a ton through stopping deforestation in Brazil, that's better than spending $500 a ton on the Brown campus. That is a very powerful and legitimate view. But there's another view and another theory of change, which is, okay, but in the long run, we also have to get to net zero, meaning we can't put any more pollution into the atmosphere than we can pull out, whether that's through nature-based approaches or through technology or whatever. And in fact, we'd like to get to negative. And if we're going to get to net zero, we have to transform our businesses. We have to transform how we produce cement and steel and plastic and how we get around and transport and we produce energy. And Brown University and everybody else has to transform their operations. This is why I loved Stephen's story. That is also a powerful theory of change. That is also true. And we don't get to that decarbonization if we just tell, if Rachel is a company and she makes a commitment and I say, okay, the way for you to do that commitment, just buy a bunch of tons to prevent deforestation, because that might not be getting at how we drive decarbonization in Rachel's industry or Rachel's business. So we have to hold both of those theories of change in our mind at a time and manage both of them. And I think that second theory of change, to be to be fair to the folks at SBTI who I don't always agree with, that's the theory of change that motivated SBTI. And so how do we think about both at once? I don't want to go on too, I'll just have a teaser and we can go into it more if there's interest. But so I think about a Venn diagram. Think about a Venn diagram with like one circle is the ton for a ton theory of change and one circle is the business transformation theory of change. What I'm really interested in is where's the overlap? And let me give you a couple of examples that I've been working on. One is, I mentioned deforestation. Okay, if you're McDonald's, Scope 3, right? Scope 3 is all the emissions that are outside your own operations and the energy you buy. So for McDonald's, you buy a lot of beef, your Scope 3 emissions, the biggest driver of your Scope 3 emissions is deforestation because beef and cattle drive deforestation in the Amazon and elsewhere. So how should you address that if you're McDonald's? Well, one view is you try to talk to suppliers and you find the one supplier or the few suppliers who commit not to cut down trees. It's more complicated than this, but to simplify, you find the suppliers who are not going to cut down the trees. But it turns out that not everybody wants to buy from those suppliers, and so you get what I had a colleague call islands of green in a sea of deforestation. You get little patches of forest that are being protected by the good suppliers while everything else is being cut down. So the other thing you could do would be to think about a systemic approach. And how do you invest in systemic protection of forest across large landscapes? Well, I talked earlier, that's one way to do that is through carbon crediting programs. And so I would argue, if you're McDonald's, the best way for you to reduce your value chain emissions is to invest in systemic protection of tropical forests in the places where you do business. And the great thing about that is, that's in that center of the Venn diagram. Because that is ton for a ton, because we can't solve climate if we don't protect tropical forests. But it's also business transformation, because you're McDonald's, you're driving the transformation of your value chains. Because I will tell you, when Mato Grosso, that state I mentioned in Brazil, reduces its emissions 94%, it doesn't do that on the margin. It does that by fundamentally changing how cattle are produced and how agriculture is done in Brazil. So that's an example in that Venn diagram. We could talk about others, but let me stop.
No, I think that lays it out really, really nicely. And I think let's spend the next 10 minutes either delving deeper into some of these issues or else talking about any of the other things that we could. I wish we had another 3 hours to delve really deeply into this, but I don't know. Annette, do you want to jump in here?
I'd like to follow up on your point about regulation here, because I don't think any of us disagrees that in a perfect world this would be regulated. But we don't live in a perfect world, and we live in a world where time is running out to address these issues. And so certainly I think what Rachel and I are involved in are organizations that are saying, we have to address this now, and we have to do it the best way we can to buy time, and in the hopes that ultimately governments do come to their senses and step up. But we can't wait for that to happen. It hasn't happened so far. In the case of the Integrity Council, we have tried to do everything in a way that mimics a regulatory process. We issued our proposals with full notice and comment the way regulators do, open for 60 days, consistent with international standards. All of our proceedings were public, and all the comments were public, and our rationales for why we came to the conclusion we did on our core carbon principles and our assessment framework, all public. With the thought that ultimately if governments decide, maybe we need to step up, but this is a real problem, this is portable. They could take it. And maybe they would want to make a few tweaks to it, but I honestly believe that what we've done is sustainable enough that there would be really modest market dislocation if they made changes. So that's what we're trying to do. I thought Nat's description of sort of the sweet spot in the Venn diagram is exactly right. I mean, one of the other things, when you think about the sweet spot for regulation here, or quasi-regulation here, one of the problems we have with some of the approaches, and I do think that SBTI, one of the problems with their approach is that, I think Nat is right. There are a lot of people who genuinely believe, and they're right, that we need to get market actors to reduce or remove their emissions to the full extent possible. And we agree with that. We think that you shouldn't be able to use credits until you've done the best you can in reducing or removing your own Scope 3 emissions. That said, it's very difficult. And in an approach where you don't have regulatory authority, and you say, you know what, I think I want to force people to do better, and I'm going to raise the bar and say that you don't satisfy my requirements unless you get to 90% of reductions. What happens if you did an economic analysis of this? What's going to happen is if people are not required to do anything, they exit the market. They do nothing. And that's the problem that we have today. We need to hit that sweet spot where companies that genuinely want to do the right thing can reduce to the extent they can. And I do think Nat's right. The vast majority are doing, really genuinely doing what they can, but they're missing the targets. They are missing their targets. And they want to do more. And we should permit them to use carbon credits to contribute to and to accelerate their transition to net zero in these early days when it's so critical that we start attacking this problem.
And I think it's even worse than that, because in many cases, like there's a lot of studies out there that those companies that use offsets are actually the ones that are decarbonizing the fastest. So, they're the ones that internally are doing more for decarbonization than their peers, because their peers are, as you said, doing nothing. And then we add a layer of complication in the sense that we take a look at Delta. Delta is probably decarbonizing faster than, say, United or one of the others, and I don't have the data, but I think that data is out there. And if they are, and they're doing offsets, but they're the ones that got sued for actually doing offsets, not the others who are not decarbonizing as quickly. And so you have actually negative incentives being placed on those that are moving quicker. Am I thinking about this wrong, Rachel?
No, I think without getting into hot water around which airline I like, let the Brown lawyers deal with you later. No,
Airline X and Airline Y.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I think we've got ourselves into a difficult position where in this teacup, where we're arguing, and I mean that, right? It's not a tiny little espresso cup, but it is a teacup. There's an argument that's going on at the moment because lots of different people are mixing up what it means to set a target, what it means to have a transition pathway, what it means to account for your emissions on an annual basis on your journey to meeting your target. What the purpose of setting that target is. All of this is getting sort of very mixed up because the purpose of a target is not a purity test. The purpose of a target is to pull, right, kicking and screaming, in the absence of regulation and in the absence of international agreement on how this is all going to happen and which sector gets measured in which kind of transition pathway over what, right? All of that is not yet built. You can't, one target can't perform a miracle. So at best it can do is create the environment whereby ICVCM and VCMI and a lot of other people are then pushing companies into action. And we have 6,000, 8,000 companies who've signed up to a science-based target, right? Versus gazillions of companies who are doing nothing, right? Including the highest polluting companies. And now we're having a circular firing squad, right, around whether or not we're going to penalize the highest performing companies in the world for having the ambition that we need everybody to have, right? And what this is doing is, not exactly getting us to the conversation which we need to have, which is how do we get out of this green hushing, green lashing that's going on, and how do we encourage whole sectors to start putting their foot into the voluntary market, because that will spur investment. While this is happening, emerging markets and developing economies are throwing their hands up and saying, for goodness sake, can you help me? We've got CBAM in Europe. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. We've got parties to the Convention on Climate Change refusing to get down and agree Article 6 rules. Article 6 is the new market that would emerge, that is supposed to have emerged after Paris. We've got our phones ringing on a daily basis from European countries and Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries asking us if they can enter into bilateral carbon agreements with them. And we've got all kinds of people running around sort of saying, we've got a voluntary carbon market deal we'd like to talk to you about, but it's complicated. And these countries are saying, can you help us, right? Can you help us get a revenue flow from these assets that we hold, which are of value to the whole world, rather than sitting having an argument about whether or not your target's pure enough, right? I have those conversations weekly. The second thing that's happening is that while we're having this conversation, which is a heavily US, European-dominated conversation, you've got Japanese companies saying, look, if somebody could just tell us it's safe to do this, we need to get in. We've got Asian companies, the fastest growth of companies that are being transparent and reporting against their climate targets are Chinese companies and Asian companies. You go to CDP, which is sort of the sort of NGO that sort of manages corporate accountability, the fastest growing segment is Chinese companies, right? So why are Asian companies interested in a pathway to net zero and understanding that the carbon markets will be part of that? Because they know that this world is coming and they know that they've got to decarbonize and they'd rather get ahead of it than be caught on the backside as regulation suddenly starts to kick in. So in this world out there, we're either going to, two things are going to happen. This gets sorted out, or other parts of the world will start making the rules. And the other parts of the world will make the rules that suit them. And so I think we've got ourselves into, because of the mistrust, because of the toxic environment, because, a large part of, everybody's frustrated that progress isn't going fast enough. But I think that we've forgotten what it means to regulate. And the last thing I want to say is the difference between science and regulation. A science-based target should be science-based, and that should be verified on that basis. But when you're regulating, you are making political and procedural judgments about what will help people move towards, in this case, move towards that target. Which means that you do your best effort and you say, okay, we're going to set, in our case, platinum here, gold here, and silver there. And then you constantly talk to the market. Is it working? Is it not working? If it isn't working, then you amend your process. That's how we regulate, and that should be open, transparent, participatory feedback to how a market regulates itself. But I think parts of the community have become so distrustful of the private sector, so distrustful of the financial sector, for good reason to some extent, and so distrustful of regulation that we've got to the point where that target has become very brittle.
And I think that issue of trust underpins a lot of questions we have, right? Like, all studies show that we're losing trust not just in government, not just in business, but in institutions, the church, universities, you name it. So I don't think anything works when you don't have trust, right? Like, no markets will work. You can't have contracts. You can't transact. Nothing works if you don't have trust. So we have to find ways to build trust as a society, but also for the voluntary carbon markets. And I think the points you're making are incredibly interesting in the sense that that Venn diagram that you laid out for us so brilliantly, Nat, it says, the two views of the world, both views are kind of saying, or one of them at least is saying, I've got science behind me. But the truth is what Rachel said, this is not about science. There's science that tells us where we need to go and the sorts of things we need to do, but there's very different policy approaches that may get us there. And we can debate about which of those are actually going to be the best ways to get there. And I think that's kind of where we are, is trying to have that debate about what is the best way to get there. Because, I know three of you very well. All of us up here would love to see the same decarbonization as, all the people that are, jumping on the bandwagon and pillaring companies or others, or saying we need to decarbonize and carbon markets and carbon credits and offsets are not the way forward. I think we all share the world we want to get to, which is dealing with climate change, and we have different views of how we actually get there. So I know, one last point. Go ahead, Annette.
One thing really quick, and then I'm really eager to hear some questions. But I just want to underscore something, because Rachel mentioned it and Annette mentioned it. And I think it's easy. We've spent a lot of time talking about the companies, and the corporates and how do they meet their targets, and that's the driver for this. But that's not the reason we're doing this, or at least not for me. I'm not doing this because I want to make it slightly easier for companies to meet targets. I'm doing it because we are hundreds of billions of dollars short of the climate finance we need every year going into the global south to cut emissions and really build sustainable development and sustain local communities. And what I always say, Annette and Rachel have heard me in that, as soon as we have enough climate finance, I will stop talking about carbon markets. And so if anyone tells me, actually, we had that billions, you have the $100 billion, you just don't know it, we're not there yet. And is this going to solve it by itself? No. If we're successful in everything we're working on, we could scale up from $1 billion, maybe $2 billion a couple years ago, I don't know, 10, 20, if we hit $20 billion a year in the voluntary carbon market, that would be amazing, because as economists, that would be $20 billion of public good investment. Maybe more than that, but every tens of billions of dollars counts. So that's why I say, that's what we're in it for. We're in it because we need that finance to flow, and we have those opportunities. So how can we do that in a way that cuts emissions and accelerates that decarbonization?
And I think one thing we haven't really gotten into here is that a lot of these projects are not just about carbon. We can't look at the world only from a carbon perspective, right? We are also facing a water crisis, a biodiversity crisis, all kinds of other crises on the environmental front. Many of these projects that we're talking about funding through the carbon markets, which is currently one of the only places where they're getting money, also have social benefits, health benefits, biodiversity benefits, water benefits, and if we do them right, we can multiply the benefits we get from all of these things. I think there is a legitimate question of how we do them right, and there is room to criticize carbon markets and carbon offsets, and we need to get them better. And I welcome the end-to-end integrity initiative that VCMI and ICVCM are bringing here, but also we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater entirely, and we need to think about, well, what are the ways we channel money to getting to where we want to go? So unless Annette or Rachel, you guys have any last words before we go to questions? All right, I see a question over here.
Please use the microphones, because for the live stream, people won't be able to hear you if you're on that phone. So just come on up and get a line for the microphone for your question.
You bet. Thank you, all of you, for your comments. And Rachel, you're hiding behind a camera now for me, but thank you, all three of you, and Ricardo for moderating. I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm the director of Climate Solutions Lab here on campus. And I wanted to ask a question about sort of who gets involved in setting these rules in your efforts to try to keep some integrity to these markets. And I accept the point that Nat's made and that Stephen's made and others, that there really are companies that genuinely do want to put some money behind this and to see some environmental good at it. And Stephen's example at the beginning was bang on target to make that point. But I also want to recognize another experience that I had this past few months of the Government of Canada was trying to set up a regulatory framework for capping the emissions from its oil and gas sector. And by creating this cap, they said, look, basically you can emit up to a certain point, and if you can't get your emissions down to that point, then guess what? You're going to be allowed to use to buy some carbon credits to buy your way out of some portion of the problem. And so then these companies, the oil and gas companies, are going to turn to markets like these ones to satisfy what is a regulatory requirement. And I think it is naive to think that these companies are particularly interested in the environmental benefit of the credits. They're interested in the lowest cost compliance mechanism that they can possibly get. That's all they care about in my experience. And you can say that I'm being distrustful, but I have 25 years of experience watching these markets. I've seen what these companies, how they operate on it. And so as I was thinking about what you're doing here to try to preserve the quality of these markets, it occurs to me that the first thing that Exxon and Chevron and Suncor are going to do are they're going to say, okay, we'd either like to have a seat at the table on your Integrity Council, and if we can't get a seat at the table on your Integrity Council, then we're going to set up the carbon market of voluntariness integrity initiative. We're going to set up our own initiative, and we're going to try to set the rules that we like. And so it strikes me that this is something of a markets for lemons problem. You've got another set of actors who are going to have very different set of preferences that are going to try to affect these rules. And I wondered what your thoughts are on preserving the integrity of the integrity initiative. Like, how do you kind of keep that as pure as you can as you're doing this work?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Who wants to go? Yeah. Let's do
Do you want to-
two more questions.
Don't
and then
worry, we'll
try
give you an answer.
and then keep going. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Natalie Steinemann. My question goes in a different direction, so I hope this doesn't distract. But you've all talked about how this is an imperfect market, how one of the big problems is trust. And you said something that a ton is a ton, but really the problem of the market that a ton isn't a ton, right? So each ton has, in a way, a confidence measure assigned to it, which is our trust in that this ton is really reduced. And so, that is also reflected in the price that people are willing to pay for that ton. But where it isn't reflected is the amount of carbon that a company is allowed to, in a way, reduce its own budget by, right? So I'm wondering if there's any movement towards saying, if I'm only, 30% confident that this ton really results in an actual reduction, does a company only get 300 kilograms of carbon reduced rather than a ton? Is there any such movement?
Yeah. Let's start with that before we get too far down the line. Does anybody want to answer Jeff's question?
Yeah, let me. So first of all, let's talk about the oil and gas sector. At the moment, there is no oil and gas company that has a credible science-based target. Therefore, there is no oil and gas company that can operate using the code of conduct of VCMI. So we didn't say oil and gas companies can't participate. We've said you have to do this. You have to have a credible transition plan. You have to be able to, and if you've got all of that, then under certain, you may choose to use up to a certain amount of credits for your, but because no company can get there, right? So if they spent less time hand-wringing about, it's hard to set a science-based target, then they could potentially participate in a high-integrity carbon market, but they can't. And of course, we know that they spend a lot of their money sort of making sure that these efforts don't go forward. So first of all, we've set. They can't participate at the moment and call that integrity. That will have implications for them in certain jurisdictions around the world where these things are now going to sort of fit into how supervision and disclosure and everything else are going to take place. The second thing I would say is that the oil and gas industry has been mithering for years. Mithering is a dialect term from the north of England, has been sort of, chuntering away that it's going to it's going to do its own thing. And it's never done it. So there is a fear that different sectors could go off and sort of, set their own targets. And I think that this drama around SBTI actually makes that more likely, not in the oil and gas sector, but say mining and minerals or steel or cement, some of these really highly carbonized sectors which are working on really aggressive transition pathways and where you're starting to see real movement, but they just can't live by the way that SBTI at the moment is understood in the market. It's preventing them from participating. So I think that you might start to see sort of sectoral initiatives, but I think I'm not sure that's probable. But I don't think the oil and gas sector will be able to do it. And then really this comes back to how Canada intends to meet its net zero target. And of course this is a huge political issue now, will be up until the election, and will obviously be a major factor in who wins the next election. And of course, we can get into a whole conversation of what happened to their carbon market more broadly. But so I think that, yes, I think part of your concern is obviously legitimate, but the point here is that this market can't. I mean, what do you expect the market to do? It can't solve all problems, but what it can do, if it has integrity, is provide a way for companies to invest more quickly and more in their transition. It can provide a revenue stream. It can, with integrity, be transparent. Prices can improve. The final thing I would say is if you look at the market today, the people who are active in the market are tech firms buying removals credits because they can afford to and because they've got a handle on their business model. What we really need, if we go back to the point that Nat, and we've all made, but Nat made very eloquently, is that what we're really trying to do is get to a better place in our transition to net zero as a global community. Then we really do need steel firms, cement firms, heavy manufacturing, shipping, everybody else, using the carbon markets to speed their transitions. And the oil and gas sector, once it gets its head around the fact that it's going to have to get to net zero too, they can join in too. But they're not there yet.
Yeah, I think that there's also an implicit question, and groups like at Brown, the Climate Development Lab, have been very good about trying to find out, disinformation campaigns and attempts to sabotage these systems. I think there's an underlying question of, is this system going to be sabotaged? Can it be sabotaged? I mean, I obviously can, but are they doing it? Have you seen any of that overt sabotage of the system?
Well,
if you can say, obviously.
So I think that the effective sabotage is the pressure that they bring on parties to the convention in their capitals around the way in which capitals are moving regulation forward, and the effective sabotage of negotiators. I think
they have bigger systems to sabotage than this one. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think that there is we don't want a seminar on the oil and gas industry, but they have a different theory of change at all, right? Which is the competition within the oil and gas sector is who's going to be able to produce the lowest cost, most efficient barrel of oil, ton of gas, metric ton of gas in 2050 or 2070 or 2100. That's the race, right? And it's going to be won by Qatar, UAE, Saudi, maybe Norway, if they're lucky, right? It's not going to be won in Canada or even in the Permian Basin or anywhere like that. And so that's the geopolitics of what's going on. That's the pushback that you see. That's why you have the language in Dubai that you have. And, I think that, the naivete really in the West around that, I think is quite extraordinary. And the real issue is, what are we going to do with the 80% of the oil and gas companies that are publicly owned, sitting in Asia, sitting in Africa, who are highly inefficient in their production and very easily supported for the moment. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which now transfers $400 of taxpayers' money for every ton of direct air capture to the oil and gas industry in this company, because that was the number that they needed to get it passed. And to get that one vote to get it over the line. So I think your students can also look at what I think is one of the largest transfers of subsidy from the American taxpayer to the oil and gas industry in recent history. And maybe in 10 years' time it will have been a price that was worth paying, but maybe not.
Yeah, a lot there. I would just say that even at low prices of carbon, it's still putting a price on carbon for those companies, and they forces them to think differently about their emissions. I think we've covered this, unless Annette or anybody else wants to. Let's take the ton as a ton question. I don't know, anybody want to talk?
Yeah, look, I think it's an important issue, right? Measuring and verifying the reductions or removals. It's certainly something that we're focused on in the CCPs. There is a lack of trust because there has been a lack of standardization around, measuring the tons and delivering on the promises of a ton is a ton. And so I think what we're seeing with these methodologies that we're assessing is, having greater confidence that the methodologies are meeting the targets to remove emissions. But as someone referred before, in any regulatory process, we're going to have to continue to look back and see how successful these things are, and to the extent that we determine that certain methodologies, let's say, are not delivering on their expectations, we have to go back and reconsider them. I mean, this is going to be an iterative process. We're going to have to continuously curate what we're doing and improve based on best science and best practice. And so we're starting with the best that we know today, and we'll just have to continue to improve.
One thing that I thought was implicit in the question was also like, if these tons are not good enough and we allow emissions, is that a mortal problem here?
So let me just address that really quick. Just one thing really quick on Jeff's point. That's Canada there is the regulator, right? So Canada can tighten the screws as much as it wants on integrity. And so that's a different question. It might draw on the work of the Integrity Council, which, we could talk more about the governance, which is very, very strong of the Integrity Council. But also Canada as a regulator, it can really crack down and enforce. I think on the ton for ton, just really quickly, because I know we have another couple of questions, but I did want to drill in on that word allowed, because we're in a voluntary market. And so nobody's allowing the companies. We shouldn't think about that, because, as Annette said very, very well, they always have the opportunity for exit. So the challenge is, how do we, I will just say it in this very plain way, like the environmental community, and I was not part of the environmental community, but not part of these efforts. My colleagues at CDP, at SBTI, at the World Resources Institute, they have pulled off an amazing magic trick, okay? They have made companies willing to pay for a public good and willing to put their money behind it. That is an incredible feat, I think, of advocacy. And now what I want to do is say, let's take advantage of that, and where companies are unable to reduce their own emissions, and Rachel said about how VCMI is putting guardrails on that, let's get them to invest in decarbonization in the Global South. The last thing I want to say, so the allowed, nobody's allowing them to do it, they are doing it voluntarily. Let's take advantage of that. Final point very quickly, without getting super wonky, we've talked a lot about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. If you are interested in this, almost everything we're talking about is and Rachel was very clear with VCMI, we're talking about having firms be able to meet their scope 3, which is their sort of value chain emissions targets, reduce their scope 3 emissions through carbon credits. And if you're interested in this and you're wondering about this, I encourage you, dig in and understand what scope 3 and how it is measured. And once you do, what you'll recognize that is scope 3 it's really just estimates and it's inventories. It's not like how much oil did you burn, right? Which you can measure and you can reduce. It's like, what's your supply chain look like? And most big companies, their supply chains go 7 or 8 steps out. And so it's very hard for companies to directly address their scope 3 emissions, which is why it could be such a powerful place to use credits.
Yeah, and I do think that there's this, if you take it to the extreme, everybody's scope 3 is the entire emissions of the world, if you take it literally, right? It's that level of broken in some ways. So I do think that this is an interesting place. So let's take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anna from the Yale School of the Environment. Why don't we have more recognition that the cost of high-quality forest carbon offsets at scale cost more than $20 or $10 to $30 a ton, coming from a forest ecology background? Thinking about permanence in a changing climate with increasing disturbance regimes, let alone the shifts in crediting towards more dynamic baselines, which create more uncertainty for project developers. It's just very hard to imagine this can be achieved at these low prices, and also to bring the value around climate finance for the Global South to have the capacity to manage forests. It has to be more than $10 to $30 a ton if this is a multi-generational commitment?
Speaking of the Climate Development Lab, we have Timmons Roberts as well, so go for it.
Thank you,
Timmons.
Ricardo. And Rachel, nice to see you again, and Nat, and Annette, I'm anyway really impressed with this panel. Great job. So my question is about regulation. You guys have said we just don't have a chance at regulation. It's not the world we live in. But Annette, you had a really nice point about how regulation is this balancing act. And I just want to hear, I mean, we were talking about voluntary carbon offsets the year I was at Oxford in 2006 and 7. And really, and using the benefits and the amount of funding for biodiversity preservation in the Amazon, a big conference we held. And so I'm just feel like here we are, that's 18 years ago. 18 years ago, and we're really not, this market has not scaled up. So is it really just we have to give up on regulation, which really was I think what I'm hearing in everything you've said is that it's the only way we're going to have standards that are really enduring.
And then let's take the last question, and then...
From the standpoint of an individual company trying to get financing for a restoration project, are these the only integrity initiatives that or are there multiple ones, and is it a problem that I don't know what standards I have to meet to make the credit viable and sellable, I guess?
Okay, great. So go ahead, Nat, you take it first.
I want to take on, first of all, I'm a Yaley, and so I'm glad to have, see somebody else from just down 95. So thanks, Anna, for the question. And I've also spent a lot of time with other colleagues thinking of doing exactly the analysis. I want to say two things just without going too far in, and would love to follow up. First of all, I would argue, and there's going to be a nature-based panel later, so Spencer knows much more about this than I do, but I've worked a lot on forests and tropical forests, and colleagues that have. And I talked about this landscape approach. If you want to get technical, it's jurisdictional RED is the name, if you want to look up the acronym. But actually, if you think about a landscape approach, and you think about what does it take, because then you're talking about programmatic policies that take place across an entire jurisdiction, a state or a country, to protect forests and reduce emissions. There are a lot of things you can do. You can improve land tenure rights, you can protect indigenous peoples, you can invest in satellite monitoring, you can invest in enforcement, you can pay small landowners. So I have a colleague, Ruben Lebowski, who was at EDF for a while and is now elsewhere, who has done some of the best econometric work on this. And if you do econometric work of what does the supply curve look like, what is the actual cost of protecting forests, you can get a lot of tropical forests protected at $10, $20, $30 a ton. But if you're doing it at a systemic level, right? So you're protecting millions of tons, and you're getting tens of millions of dollars. And that's based on real careful analysis of what the risks are to the land. So you're right. The price needs to be appropriate, but I think there's some good econometric analysis, probably toward the upper end of that. But that makes it feasible to really do it at scale. I'll also say one last thing, and this is probably more for the nature-based issue, but I know Spencer will go into this. The issue of permanence is a really important one to dig into. Permanent that's a big word. Permanent is like hundreds of years. And if our
As a friend of mine used to say, forever is a very long time.
Forever is a very long time. And this is relevant because there are conversations in California going on by some well-meaning people, some not so well-meaning people in California trying to put this in legislation. If our standard is that you can only get credit for a permanent ton, and meaning that you have to be able to ensure that it never ever goes back into the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years, because that's how long a ton of emissions last in the atmosphere, then we're giving up. We cannot solve climate change if we don't protect and if we don't halt and reverse tropical deforestation in the coming decade. We just are out of luck. And so if our goal is, well, you can't get a credit for that unless it's permanent, that's going to be a real obstacle. Last thing I'll say, because I know others will, but last thing, I'm just kidding.
You're just getting going.
Just getting going.
Yeah.
But we ought to be thinking differently about permanence. If when the state, I'll just say this thing, you can watch my TED Talk if you want more. But if this,
of course you have
genuinely,
a TED Talk,
I do have a TED Talk on this. But when the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil has cut emissions 94% over a decade and a half, while cattle production went up and soybean production went up, that is a fundamental shift in agriculture. That actually those tons are permanent. they are not coming back. And that because it was a shift in production and it was a shift in how the forest is used. So we ought to be thinking about permanence in a different way than just, did we stick a ton in the ground and it's never ever going to come out.
And I would just say, $10 is more than zero, which is currently what we're paying for these things. So I think that's a better thing. Stephen, are you going to cut us all off?
I am going to cut you all off because, or maybe just 2 minutes more because we're already running into the time for the next panel.
Right. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of talk about nature-based solutions, so we won't go in there. Does anybody want to take the second question? Timon's question of like regulation, and is that really what we're saying? That
I think it would be wrong to walk out of the session and think that there isn't movement. There is extraordinary movement. There's extraordinary movement around the treatment of carbon, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Not as fast or as comprehensive as we would like, but there is movement. There is extraordinary movement in the regulation of corporate behavior. From the move from voluntary to mandatory of reporting, the TCFD, corporate reporting on their emissions.
Even SEC disclosure regulations.
SEC disclosure. So if you look at Europe, you look at the UK, look at Australia, look at Japan, look at what's happening in India now, look at China, look at SEC. So it is moving, and you're also seeing the beginning of, I think, of cohesion in the ecosystem of how do you report the move from voluntary to mandatory, who sort of validates that reporting, how transparent is that reporting, how can it be used for other investment and other decisions. You're also seeing extraordinary movement in the way in which perhaps pieces of regulation that we haven't thought about before, advertising standards authorities and consumer protection bureaus making rules about how corporates may or may not think about or use the language of carbon neutrality or net zero targets. You're starting to see, obviously, strategic litigation backing that up as well. So there is a lot happening. Now, if you're a corporate, you've got to make sense of all of that. And, that's one thing if you're sitting in the big corporate office of a global conglomerate. It's very scary if you're halfway down a global value chain and you're trying to work out what all these different tectonic plates are doing, and it's not all joined up. And more on that over coffee. And then finally, I would just say to the last question, I think it is very confusing if you're a corporate. Which registry do you use? Are you confident in them? Where are they in their journey? What's their relationship to ICVCM? So I think this will start to clarify. And as the market matures, then you'll get better prices. The demand is there. It's got to start flowing. The supply is, the guardrails are there. And then you start to see differentiated products. You start to see differentiated prices. You can now buy an insurance product in London or elsewhere in case you think that your credits are not going to be realized. You're starting to see what we would expect to see in a maturing market, a set of other tools and products that will help the market grow.
Yeah, and we even have credit rating agencies, some of them represented in the room that will speak later around these things. So I want to thank the panelists. I think it's been a really interesting session. And I'll just say one final thing, that remember that the alternative to a world with carbon credits and offsets may not be a perfect world with everything working, everything measured, and everything accounted for. It may also be a worse world where none of this is measured, none of this is regulated, and few people are actually doing anything on the ground, and less money going to developing countries or forests or whatever you care about on the ground. So with that, again, thank you for the time, and sorry to go over, Stephen. Thank you.